So we'll move on now and talk a little bit about acidosis and alkalosis. All of this has to do with the concentration of hydrogen ions in our blood, the little orange circles. The reason this all matters clinically is that protein folding is determined by the characteristics of amino acids, and the characteristics of amino acids can be altered by the pH of their environment. So what does that mean? As we know, our DNA determines what proteins we build, and we are in turn built of proteins. So when our DNA is transcribed to mRNA at the very top of this diagram, and then our mRNA enters the ribosome and is met by all the transfer RNA, the Ts, that carry amino acids, the amino acids join into chains called polypeptide chains. Because each amino acid in the chain has certain characteristics such as charge, hydrophilicity, hydrophobicity, etc., they cause the chain to immediately start to fold into a predictable shape. It's the shape of this folding that gives the protein its function. Changing the pH, or changing the concentration of hydrogen ions in the blood, affects the properties of amino acids, thereby changing the shape that the protein folds into. And if the shape is wrong, then the protein doesn't function as we expect it to, and people get very sick. So it's critical that in order to maintain physiological function, we maintain a fairly constant pH. Physiological pH is usually between 7.35 and 7.45. We can talk about the pH scale in another lesson because it gets a bit mathy. But for now, just know that a lower pH is more acidic and a higher pH is more alkaline. We like to operate somewhere close to the middle. So how do we maintain this critical balance between acidosis and alkalosis? You'll often see some variation of this diagram in textbooks. What it's showing us is the mechanism that we use to balance pH. In the middle of the diagram is carbonic acid, which is actually a bit of a theoretical construct. Carbonic acid, like all acids, doesn't stick together very well, so there's actually very little carbonic acid ever present in a solution. But we still talk about the components of carbonic acid collectively as though they were an actual molecule, just because it makes things simpler. If we talk about carbonic acid, we're really just talking about the concentration of hydrogen ions in the plasma. The first thing to recall and notice is that molecules are made up of atoms. So there's a molecule of carbonic acid in the middle of this diagram, made up of atoms of hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. Atoms are never created nor destroyed in chemistry, so if you look on the left side and count up the number of carbon atoms, you'll see that it's exactly the same number that occur in the middle and on the right side of the diagram. The same goes for the hydrogen atoms and the oxygen atoms. In other words, if you rearrange the atoms from the CO2 and the H2O that you see on the left as though they were pieces of Lego, you can turn them into the carbonic acid molecule in the middle. Or if you rearrange them again, you can turn them into the hydrogen ions and the bicarbonate ion that you see on the right side. So how does this work to balance the pH? Let's just use some examples to illustrate the idea. If I produce some hydrogen ions through glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, which as you probably recall from other lessons are just the normal processes of metabolism, I can represent those by adding hydrogen ions to the right side. As we go through this, it'll become clear that the right side of the diagram is the metabolic side, and the left side is the respiratory side. If I add hydrogen ion to the right side of the diagram, it will immediately combine with the bicarbonate ion, which is a common buffer that circulates around the body. And when the carbonic acid travels through the bloodstream to the lungs, it dissociates into CO2 and H2O, which are excreted every time we breathe. So we're effectively able to eliminate the acid simply by breathing. If we approach this from the other side, if we add CO2 to the left side, the CO2 and the H2O atoms rearrange themselves into carbonic acid. Carbonic acid immediately dissociates into the plasma, into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions, and these are eliminated by the kidneys. The kidneys, incidentally, can also retain bicarbonate and hydrogen ions to compensate for an altered pH. What we really need to take away from this diagram is just that there is a fluid relationship between CO2 and water on the left side and the bicarbonate and hydrogen ions on the right side. The left side is the respiratory side, in other words, breathing controls the pH, and the right side is the metabolic side, where metabolism and the action of the kidneys control the pH. If we add hydrogen ions to either side of the balance sheet, they have to be eliminated on one side or the other, or the pH will fall. If we subtract hydrogen ions from either side of the balance sheet, they have to be retained on one side or the other, or the pH will rise.